Matthew 17. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. We just finished one of the central passages of the book, defining or explaining to us Jesus' identity. Peter's confession, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God, followed immediately by Jesus' clearer and more full teaching about his coming death, even his resurrection. So much of the core information about Jesus and his person and his work is now being fully revealed to the disciples. And chapter 17 extends that idea another step with the transfiguration. Matthew 17:1, very soon after the events of Peter's confession, only 6 days later, Jesus takes with him a subset of the disciples. I would understand this probably to be an extension of the idea we gave earlier, that Jesus' focus is moving from the crowds and the Pharisees and the scribes and everyone down to his focus on the disciples privately and specifically. And even in this case, 3 specific leaders among the disciples who will have a particular role. He was transfigured before them. We just kind of use this word, the transfiguration, but the idea is transformed. His face shone like the sun. His clothes became white as light. And we have to understand, just for starters, what's happening here in terms of Jesus receiving this glory. One of the other Gospels uses that language, and it is the idea that Jesus was given glory from the Father, or he received glory from the Father. So there is the recognition here of a strong connection between the Father and Son. But there is also a further idea, and I think a proper way really to think about what's happening in terms of the glory here is to recognize this is the glory that was Jesus from the beginning of time. We see this in John 17, Father, glorify me with the glory which I had with you before the world was. And so therefore, we're not looking at something new as though Jesus is receiving a kind of foreign alien type of glory. But it is really that he humbled himself during the time of his earthly ministry. And now for this moment, that glory is being seen in his fullness, the glory that is actually his, the glory that he temporarily set aside during the time of his earthly ministry. There's something more to be said about that glory, and that is that you can follow a pattern with this kind of language that takes you to the Old Testament and describes not just Jesus, but Yahweh. He was transfigured, his face shone like the sun, his clothes became white as light. And just watch here, the Ancient of Days took his seat, his clothing was white as snow. And a bit later in Ezekiel, we see a parallel kind of description. I saw the appearance at his waist as it were the appearance of fire. There was brightness around him. Or Revelation, we see the hairs of his head were white, like white wool, like snow, his eyes like flame of fire, and his face was like the sun shining in full strength. So I have language here that really tells me something more about Jesus' glory, that stretches further out and connects to deeper roots across Scripture. Now, the disciples are, of course, in awe at what's happening here. And their response is partly that just being overwhelmed. They can't even understand the glory of what's going on here. And Peter's response then in verse 4, Peter said, Lord, it is good to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. There are probably 2 issues with what he's saying here. And one is the notion of, well, let's just remain here forever. When in fact, Jesus has been very clear in his teaching. No, I'm going to suffer. I'm going to die. Then I will rise again. It's not really the sense, okay, and so now we have arrived and this is the end, as though we can just stay here indefinitely. But it is the idea that this is very much a temporary thing. And Peter's response probably erodes some of that notion. But the core and central issue with what Peter just said is his statement, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Now, he is at least addressing Jesus rather than addressing Moses and Elijah. That, I suppose, is positive in his defense. But the problem with this is that Peter has just put together on one plane or in one comparison Jesus with the other two. I should comment first on why Moses and why Elijah. All kinds of ideas predominate and people guess at different things. I think the simplest idea here is that they represent respectively the climax of the law and the prophets. In other words, Moses, the giver or the one who spoke the law through God's direction, and Elijah, kind of the climax among the prophets. And you can see why this would be relevant if you go to later on in the Gospels, Jesus tied to the prophets, beginning with Moses and all the prophets. He interpreted the things in all the scriptures concerning himself. So you have, at least specifically by name here, Moses, and elsewhere there's actually reference to Elijah, or the prophet like Elijah, kind of a concept with both of them that they represent possibly the climax, or as major and the most significant representatives of these two categories, Moses and the prophets. But even this passage gives me a little hint of something more. He interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. And the point of this is to say, it is not as though in, let's say, the framework of Islam, we have different prophets and they all kind of are in there on the similar level, and Jesus is one more. As though, okay, Moses, Elijah, and Jesus, and here we can build 3 tabernacles and they stand at the same level. On the contrary, no. Moses and Elijah point to Jesus. Jesus is the center of all of the scriptures, and certainly of the ministry of Moses and Elijah. And therefore, for Peter to respond as he did, asking a question like, well, can we then set up a tabernacle or a place, a tent for each one of these 3, and in so doing to put them together as if they are on the same level, violates at the center the whole point of the transfiguration, the whole point of Jesus' ministry. Jesus is the center of this prophecy, of this event. Jesus is the center of all of Scripture. Jesus is the point of it all. And that explains then why the voice responded as it did. The answer from the voice that comes from the cloud, "This is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." Now I'm going to add inflection in here just to, I think, give us the sense that is communicated in the words, this one, this is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. When they lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. I think that's also quite relevant. As a way of summarizing the entire event, Moses and Elijah are gone. Moses and Elijah are not there to show that Jesus is rising to their level. Moses and Elijah were there to show that Jesus is the fulfillment that they pointed to, but that's all. These are not equals. And the voice's words, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him," this actually has stronger roots going back across the Old Testament, very deep roots, and very significant roots in messianic prophecies. So we can go to Matthew 3:17, the earlier event of Jesus' baptism, where actually the words were quite parallel. You'll notice, "This is my beloved Son," this is the transfiguration. Matthew 3, the baptism, "This is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased." So the language is actually identical. It's this last phrase that's added. I'll return to that in a moment. Where that language is drawn from, "This is my beloved Son," drawn from Psalm 2, "You are my Son, today I have begotten you." Or Isaiah 42:1, "This is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen in whom my soul delights." That's the language of, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased." And that explains then the first phrase, "This is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased." It's this last phrase, the "listen to him," that's kind of left there. And that part of that phrase is drawn even deeper from Deuteronomy. "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is to him that you shall listen." And I'll comment here, let's process a little bit the context of the Deuteronomy 18 passage. It's interesting that that was Moses speaking all the way back early in Israel's history. It's the same Moses who, of course, appears on the mountain. Moses saying in Deuteronomy 18 that God will raise up another prophet, a greater prophet, and that prophet will speak absolute truth, and you must listen to everything he says. When that prophet comes, he speaks with total authority. That Deuteronomy 18 prophecy became very important all the way into the New Testament. You see language like, is this the prophet? And even reference to specifically the prophet greater than Moses, such that you get the strong impression that people were familiar with this idea. And when the voice is citing this, listen to him, pointing to him, he's identifying, God's identifying Jesus as that prophet, the prophet to whom you must listen. And in all of the framework then of the entire passage, back to the Transfiguration, the idea of what the voice has just spoken, what God has just spoken, is to affirm what our point earlier, Moses and Elijah are not parallel to Jesus. I mean, here, there are three individuals, and they're all individuals who spoke for God, but they are not the same. This one is my beloved son. I'm well pleased with everything he does. You listen to him. Moses and Elijah are gone. And that affirms, as we continue to unfold the teaching of Jesus in Matthew, that Jesus is the source of truth. Jesus is the one to whom every person must listen. Another interesting passage, Peter later reflects on this, and this is in one of Peter's epistles. This is 2 Peter chapter 1. Peter, looking backwards on his memory of the event, tells his listeners or his readers that we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. He refers to the Transfiguration when he received honor and glory from God the Father, and the voice was borne to him, "This is my beloved son with whom I am well pleased." I mean, it's enough information that you can't miss what he's referring to. We ourselves heard this very voice. We were with him on the holy mountain. And then he goes on, though. All of this is to affirm, I had experience, he says, direct experience, seeing Jesus in his glory. But he confirms that actually Scripture gives you an even clearer revelation. Scripture, then, is the authority to which you turn. And I think the interesting thing here is that Jesus' words, listen to him. This one, Jesus is my beloved son. Listen to his words. Jesus' words are recorded in the New Testament, so that the application of the Transfiguration for me and for you is open the New Testament and read Jesus' words. Look no further for an experience. Look for no other source of information. Look for no one else. Listen to Jesus' words. He is God's beloved son. In fact, Jesus' words continue, of course, within this passage itself. And you see the pattern of Jesus talking to affirm or to reveal his coming crucifixion. Matthew 17:12. Elijah has already come. They did to him whatever they pleased. He's referring to John the Baptist. So also the Son of Man will certainly suffer at their hands. And again, Jesus tells them, repeating his earlier idea from Matthew 16, the Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him. He will be raised on the third day. Very specific information, pointing specifically to his death and his resurrection. The disciples are greatly distressed. They're struggling to understand, appreciate, and accept. In fact, you can see this pattern again through the passage. You see Peter's failure that we already talked about. Here, kind of their struggle. The disciples understood that he spake unto them. Finally, they understood that he spake of John the Baptist. They're exceedingly distressed here, and even talking about their unbelief here. I mean, you've got a pattern across the chapter of the disciples more or less failing to listen to Jesus, failing to appreciate the fullness of the truth that he's revealing, even as Jesus continues to reveal the truth about his death and resurrection. The final incident of the chapter, though, warrants certainly our attention. And this is this incident with the tax. Now, a little bit of an explanation that's helpful here. The tax we often hear as kind of focused on Jesus' relationship to Caesar or the government. And that, I think, is because when we hear tax, we immediately think in that sense, responsibility one has to the government. But if you actually read through the incident and you pay careful attention to what's going on, we're talking about something else. Talking about the tribute actually refers to the temple tax. The temple tax was something that each Jewish man was required to give, and it's based actually in the Old Testament law. So Exodus 30, 11 to 16 prescribes this. It's a biblical requirement. And the interesting thing here then is that what Jesus is engaging with is the question of whether he is responsible to fulfill this requirement of Scripture. So is Jesus putting aside the law by initially not paying this tax, or at least affirming that he doesn't have to pay the tax? A couple of interesting graphics first. This is a hoard of coins that were taken from an area just near the temple during the Herodian era. These are actually coins from outside. And the supposition here is probably Jewish people coming from another area, distant area, coming in, have to trade in their coins to buy enough to have the single shekel to pay the temple tax. And this is done on an annual basis. We actually have, of course, also recovered shekel temple tax coins. I mean, coins that would pay this tax. And this is the kind of thing that we're talking about, that each Jew would pay this amount to kind of support the existence of the temple, or to ensure that the temple continued onward. But the interesting thing in Jesus' argument is that he's talking about his status as the one in respect to this temple tax, the Son of the Father. Jesus asked, what do you think? From whom do kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others? And Peter answers, well, from others. The idea is the king himself is the one receiving the tax. Why would the king pay tax to himself? It doesn't make sense. Jesus said to him, then the sons are free. And that in reference to Jesus' responsibility to the tax, and that in reference to the temple, is very striking. Because part of Jesus' point here is that he, as the one who is related to the Father, he as the one who actually is truly God, he as the one who is greater than the temple, which was said earlier in Matthew, is not responsible to pay the temple tax like everyone else, like in fact Scripture itself requires of every Jewish male. Jesus is making an assertion about his own status as God. Jesus Christ is not required to pay the temple tax because he is the one who owns the temple and all of earth. He created it all. It's all his. Jesus Christ in all of his fullness and his glory. Matthew 17 then presents to us the full image of Jesus Christ in his greatness, his power, and his glory. And it calls us before him to recognize that glory, and in response, knowing that this is God's beloved Son, in whom God is well pleased, in whom there is no lack, in whom everything that he ought to have done has been fulfilled. God is pleased with his action. Jesus Christ. This person, listen to him. And taking then the response of this chapter, we come to God's words and we listen. What has Jesus said to me? May my heart and my mind be prepared to listen to everything he says.